Vor ein paar Tagen haben wir auf diesem Kanal die Frage gestellt, ob Wladimir Putin Recht hat im Ukraine-Konflikt. Und heute schauen wir uns eine andere Perspektive an. Und zwar spreche ich heute mit dem ehemaligen Oberbefehlshaber der US-Armee in Europa, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Mr. Hodges, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the privilege.
So my first question is a quite naive one, almost a super simplistic one. We all know that NATO is a self-defense alliance. We all know that Russia is not part of the NATO and that Ukraine is not part of NATO. So why then is NATO deploying more and more soldiers and getting their armies ready to attack or to defend? What's going on?
Well, it's a good question, but I would say that the situation is about so much more than Ukraine. It's not just about Ukraine. Ukraine is not an island. Ukraine is the only country where people died with an EU flag in their hand. President Putin does not fear NATO expansion. He fears expansion of democracy, of countries on his border beginning to look like Estonia or Lithuania, where former Soviet republics discover what's possible in a liberal democratic society. That's what he fears. So what does that have to do with NATO? NATO is a defensive alliance, but it's also a political alliance. And the values that bring nations together that form NATO are all about their liberal democratic values. And I think that if President Putin is allowed to smash a country that wants to enjoy those liberal democratic values, then I think that affects all of Europe, because there will be other countries that will suffer the same fate. And all of the former Soviet republics know what that was like. That's why they wanted to join NATO. So this is about more than just whether or not Ukraine is on one side of NATO or the other. Yesterday, I heard President Zelensky say, when he was asked by BBC, aren't you ready to drop your ambition to join NATO? And of course he said, this is not about NATO, this is about our people. I thought it was a good answer.
And speaking of yesterday, current events are developing pretty fast. Your president, Joe Biden, said that he's right now convinced that Russia is going to attack. And in one of your interviews a few days ago, you also said that it's almost certain that there's going to be an attack before the end of February. And I just wanted to know, is it from a strategic point, since you were a lieutenant general, is it good to let the enemy or the other side know what you are expecting the enemy to do? Or is it better kind of to be prepared, but not to speak openly what you expect from the enemy?
This is one of the most interesting aspects for me of this entire situation, because this is a new tactic, if you will, by the United States. I mean, actually by the West, because it's not just the United States. Clearly the president has access to intelligence that I would not have, or other retired people would not have. So I put validity in what he says and what comes from the Congress, what comes from our Secretary of State. And of course, everybody in American government remembers what happened before the war in Iraq, where we made statements, we had evidence, and obviously we were wrong. And so there's going to be great reluctance to talk about intelligence unless you are absolutely 100% sure. I think it's also been compelling that so many other allied governments, including Germany, UK, and so on, agree with what's being said, the intelligence. So that means it would have to be very compelling if even somebody from the German government, for example, would concur with what President Biden is saying. Having said that, I like it because for the first time, we are in front of the narrative. And so now the Russians every day have to say, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, that's not us. And of course they have almost no credibility anymore. And so I think it's a good approach to change the narrative instead of us always responding to whatever the Kremlin says. The danger, of course, is if we go too far, and at some point, people are going to be saying, "Hey, you said it was going to happen this week," and so the old we cry wolf too much, then nobody will pay attention. And so I'm sure that the President and Secretary Blinken and Mr. Sullivan are thinking through where is that point? At what point have we gone too far and lost our credibility? There's one other downside. When I met with President Zelensky 3 weeks ago, he talked about the damage to his economy of Russian pressure all around what I would call like a boa constrictor, with over 100,000 soldiers, the Russian Navy. I mean, Ukraine is really surrounded on 3 sides. And that obviously puts huge pressure on his economy. European and American companies are leaving. Airlines are suspending flights, which I think this is exactly what the Kremlin wants, of course, to strangle Ukraine so that the economy collapses and the government would collapse. And there's a danger that what the administration is doing, this constant, the attack is coming, accelerates the damage to the economy. And this is I think this is why there was a difference between how the White House views the threat and how the Zelensky government is responding to it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great analysis, because the newspapers are writing about the political chess fight, who will attack when and how and if, and you are mentioning the economic chess game that's taking place on another board, where, of course, the political danger is strangling the Ukrainian economy. I think a very interesting thought to keep in mind. I have another question, since you told me in our little conversation before the interview that you like history. And especially about the history, people are really not agreeing about the narrative. Should or could, or was there some promise that the NATO expansion in the eastern countries like Poland and Baltics and so on was actually, was there a promise that NATO would stop in Germany in the 90s, or wasn't there a promise? And I had a few days an historian on from Switzerland who said that there was a promise, even if it was not a written promise. There have been, amongst others, Baker or Genscher and other politicians who actually bilaterally said that we are not going to go 1 inch further to the west. And if this narrative is correct, then the NATO would have broken its promise, but you could also view it as, since there is no written contract, agreement or something, then this promise was not binding or was not serious. How do you view that promise? Was it given, was it not, and what implications does it have for the justification of Putin?
Well, let me say first, whether or not there ever was a promise or an implied promise or even a discussion actually is irrelevant. The bigger issue is, why would the United States and Russia be making decisions about the future of other countries over their head? I think this is the greater sin, that 2 great powers, as if we were in the 18th century, are making decisions about the future of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine. I think this is the greater sin. And so, now, I can't dodge the question. Of course, I hear this a lot, that somehow the West broke a promise. I'm skeptical of this, partly because, think of who the Russians had that would have been involved in these discussions. These would not be amateur diplomats. Okay, we're talking about very, very serious people. And if, in fact, there had been a real, no kidding, commitment, they would have pulled the evidence out. There would have been much more significant evidence of some sort of a commitment like that, I think, given the people that we're talking about. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's say that somebody on the U.S. side or on the NATO side said that. So what? So what? I mean, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of people in countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. As soon as they could, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, they immediately headed to the EU and to NATO saying, please let us in. We want to be a part of that. And I think that it's worth remembering that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was at its weakest, I mean, on its knees, not one NATO aircraft violated Russian airspace. Not one NATO vehicle drove into Russian sovereign territory. What did we do? We began to disarm immediately. All of your followers will recall the famous peace dividend. So we did the opposite of expansion into a Russian sphere, which should not exist. Instead, we began to, for the U.S., we began to send our troops home from Europe. I can remember I was a young officer at the time, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. Just 10 years before, I had been a lieutenant in Germany at the height of the Cold War. I mean, every day we were ready. And there were millions of Soviet troops and their allies and millions of NATO troops on this side in Western Germany. And now it's like, this is fantastic. Germany's going to reunify. We can get on with life. The Bundeswehr began to disarm as fast as it could. The British Army began to send their troops home off the continent back to Great Britain. That was our response to this. And so the question is, the West broke a commitment. The question is, why did every country that used to be a part of the Soviet Union want to join the European Union at the first chance? Why did they seek shelter inside the alliance? Now, it's a fair question it's a fair criticism that we, the West, perhaps are guilty of hubris, that now everybody's going to be democratic, there's going to be capitalism, everything's going to be wonderful. And of course, we know now that in Russia, a great country with fantastic people that has produced thousands and thousands of incredible artists and writers and more mathematicians and physicists than any country in the world per capita, but they did not have the foundations that are necessary for liberal democratic society, like existed in so many European countries, and that you don't declare we're now democratic and we have capitalism. It has to grow, and I think we surely made a mistake there. We were not prepared for what happened so fast. Mm-hmm. That's a fair criticism.
Yeah, and by the way, you also have written a book with some fellow co-authors. It's called Future War, also available in German, Bedrohung und Verteidigung Europas. And in this book, you are having an interesting quotation, or a few quotations that I wanted to ask you about. So in the Russia chapter, you have written that given the nature of the Putin Kremlin, any dialogue must always be informed by strength. And I'm very curious about that, because normally when you study, I went to school in Germany, it's all about peace and flowers and harmony and holding hands. And a little bit later, you also write, too many Europeans, and I quote from the book, have abandoned or are abandoning the war-fighting ethos, including the ethos of close combat, vital to successful conduct of war. So in the book, it's kind of a non-German approach, of course, but you are saying that dialogue has to be accompanied with strength, and there also should be a war-fighting ethos. How does that play into the hands of Vladimir Putin, since he seems also to be a kind of war ethos kind of guy? So is it dangerous if both big countries, US or NATO and Russia, are both playing the war ethos game? Or would it be better maybe to take a German approach and say, yeah, we have 5,000 helmets, good luck with those?
Well, I'm sure those 5,000 helmets will become very nice table decorations in Ukrainian homes at some point. Look, we don't need German weapons in Ukraine, I don't think. I mean, the decision to provide the 5,000 Gefechtshelm was probably well-intentioned, but it became instant meme material. What we need is Germany as the champion of European values and the champion of the gesamte europäische Friedensordnung to defend that. If we're serious about values, and if you're serious about a peace and stability order in Europe, it doesn't just happen. You have to defend it. You have to protect it. You have to invest in it. And there's nothing warlike about that. And we know from about 5,000 years of history that in human life, no matter how unfortunate this may be, that there will always be an aggressor who will take advantage of weakness. Think about when Russian forces invaded Georgia in 2008. 2008. So this is more than 15 years after the reunification of Germany, more than 15 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and after the U.S. Army had sent home almost everything. We had gone from 300,000 troops in Europe down to about 30,000. All of the tanks, armored vehicles, gone home. Bundeswehr, the once great Bundeswehr that had 12 divisions, now had 3 divisions, and those 3 divisions were not even full anymore. No more British Army of the Rhine. So in other words, we were at our weakest. And then Russia decides to invade Georgia. Russia supports the Assad regime. 2014, Russia invades Ukraine. So in other words, we were at our weakest. And what did they do? They take advantage of that. And well, we were naive. I mean, right here in Munich, 15 years ago, President Putin, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, talks about what a disaster it was for the world that the Soviet Union collapsed, and that this unipolar world will mean the failure or the end of international institutions. We should have been listening, not as so much as a warning, but to realize who we're dealing with. And this is the key to successful dialogue, is to understand who is it with whom you are having a dialogue. This is a guy whose government uses poison, chemical weapons, on his own people, on his own opposition. Think about where Mr. Navalny is right now. I mean, the only thing left for poor Mr. Navalny is to be executed, because the Russians have done the Kremlin has done everything to make sure he could never inspire any sort of color revolution or even basic opposition that we take for granted here in Europe and in the United States. What are they so scared of? That they would use poison and track down their opposition and kill them in Berlin in the Tiergarten, or poison them inside UK. They use cyber to destroy societal structures and disinformation that causes us to lose confidence, trust in each other and in our own liberal democratic institutions. So absolutely we should have dialogue, absolutely. And the best way to have a meaningful dialogue with the Kremlin is when you have 30 nations of NATO, shoulder to shoulder, saying, we are going to defend these values, that this is unacceptable, what you are doing. And by the way, if there is an attack in Ukraine, where are the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians going to go that are trying to escape the combat? They're coming straight into Western Europe, into the European Union. Hundreds of thousands of refugees will be coming. International water in the Black Sea that many nations depend on, including all the nations that along the Danube River, the Donau, that empties into the Black Sea. I mean, this is so much more than combat just on Ukraine. So nobody I know that wears a uniform wants to see a conflict, because we know what it's like. I saw a young lady last night. She worked for a German television studio. She was standing there, and and we were having a conversation before an interview. And one of the other gentlemen that was standing there read off of his phone a comment about what Russia was doing at a news report. And I watched her reaction, and she just shook her head, and it really hit me. I mean, here's a smart young woman in the news business, and she's listening to this report of what's happening, and on her face it was like, oh my God, there is going to be a war. And the look of sadness was so genuine that this is very real, and we have got to prevent it. But we know from thousands of years of history, the way you prevent it is not by saying, please don't attack.
And at the end of the conversation, I want to have a broader perspective on this conflict. For instance, looking at China and the president of China, I'm sure he is also really interested how the West is handling the crisis. And to me, it seems that what Eastern Ukraine is to Ukraine, Taiwan could be for China. So what do you think are the implications for China, as my penultimate question, and maybe also for other strong nations that probably will not respect the borders so much if they get away with it, the Russians?
Well, you have hit one of the most important points of this whole situation. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party leadership is watching this. And if the United States, with all of our allies and all of our friends and the combined diplomatic power and the combined economic power, not just military power, but the diplomatic and economic power, the moral authority of countries like Germany, if we are not able to deter President Putin from attacking or continuing his attacks inside Ukraine, if we can't deter that, which is so obviously a violation of international law, then I am worried that they will not be too terribly impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan, South China Sea. We, the collective we, did nothing about Hong Kong after they smashed Hong Kong. I mean, not even UK reacted very strongly there. So that doesn't mean that there's going to be an attack on Taiwan in the next 6 months. But it will give the Chinese reason to think that the relationship, the alliance between these so-called liberal democratic countries, maybe it's not so strong. So this has significant implications. For people that care about sovereignty, international law, our values, this has big implications.
And I think not only China, it could have also difficult implications in other countries like Africa, where borders are kind of arbitrary. So a stronger state could say to the weaker state, you can see that borders are not so important in the 21st century. So big problems coming there. And my final question is about your new book. There was a new term. I didn't know the term before. So in the future war, you're writing, and I'm quoting you, future war is hyperwar, war at the level of such speed of strategy, technology, and destruction that its effects could be worse than World War II. And of course, we all remember what World War II was about. Could you explain to us this idea of, first of all, this future war that you're talking about in the book, but also the idea of the hyperwar, since probably this is a new term for many listeners?
This is what is so worrisome about what's happening right now in and around Ukraine, is that this could get out of control very quickly. Events begin to happen faster than we can respond, and you could have what we would call spillover into a NATO country. So that right there will change the dynamic. But hyperwar really talks about, because of advances in technology, with artificial intelligence, the quantum computing that allows things to happen faster than normal human comprehension and communication processes could affect it. Are we ready for that? You know, it's important, of course, to figure out there's an ethical aspect to artificial intelligence. There's an ethical aspect to unmanned systems. Nobody would argue with that. Certainly I would not argue with that, or my two co-authors. But the fact is, our adversaries are using and developing and using these capabilities as fast as they can. Even President Putin said, whoever gets there first in terms of the use of artificial intelligence is going to win. And of course, he's not encumbered by things such as ethics or a Bundestag or a Congress or a parliament. So I think it's important. One of the themes of our book is that European countries have to come to grips with the reality of the threat, and each nation has to figure out what are the policies that will govern the development and the use of these capabilities. Whether it's about no weapons on unmanned systems, or policies about the use of artificial intelligence that puts it in certain categories. That's the duty and right of every sovereign nation to think through that. But we have to be realistic. If our adversaries are using these capabilities, are we prepared to defeat them in order to protect our populations and our values?
Mm-hmm. And I think the special effect, if I might say so, of this book is that it's not written by some guys who studied literature or economics, but from three military experts who are really knowing what they're talking about. At the end, I have a question that is not mine, but I promised this to one of my best friends who is also a teacher of history. And this is also a very critical one, but I'm sure you can give him a nice response. And the idea is about the US empire, the global empire, the idea that wherever you look in the world, actually America has certain types of interests. And some people view the United States as still a global empire, close or parallel to China. What are you telling those history teachers in Germany who still view America as a global empire, hopefully of democracy, but maybe of destabilization of countries, of difficult or different wars? How could you respond as a former general to those people who are really viewing the role of the United States pretty critically? How could you maybe take away the fears a little bit?
The word empire, of course, has such a implication to it that most Americans kind of shrink back from it because we don't see ourselves as having an empire. But certainly, there's no doubt that American pop culture, American business. I mean, everybody uses Google, everybody uses Amazon, everybody depends on these kind of things that are generally mostly positive, and they are the result of an American idea about individual creativity, initiative, rewarding initiative. But where we run into problems is when the idea of initiative and freedom and creativity is not anchored to a foundation that's based on law, that's based on respect for human rights, that's based on making sure we take care of all of our society. Basically all the things common to a liberal democratic society. And right now, if there's an American empire, and I would never say there is, but if somebody perceives that there is, we are in real danger because that foundation of liberal democratic society is under massive pressure in the United States. Every German that I've ever talked to asked me, what in the hell happened on January the 6th? How could this happen in America? I asked the same question. Look, I have been in and around Europe for over 40 years, and the favorite sport for most people was to criticize the United States for whatever it was. But at the same time that my German friends or my British friends or my Dutch friends would criticize the United States, underneath that criticism was this expectation of the United States to live up, to be an ideal. Nobody expects the United States to be perfect, but there was an expectation that we would continue to represent the ideals. I mean, there's a reason that hundreds of thousands of people every year risk their life trying to get to the United States. It's because of what it represented. And I think right now we are not living up to our own talking points. I still shake my head, not only what I saw on January 6th, but what I saw in the months leading up to it. And since then, there's still people in our Congress, Republicans, that say that was legitimate political discourse. On what planet? So we've got to fix ourselves, and I think the Biden administration has correctly said that American foreign policy has to be based on strong domestic policy and those foundations before we can start wagging our finger at other countries. I do feel like we are reestablishing important relationships with our allies. We also have very high expectations of our German ally. Germany has benefited from the post-war era more than any other country in the world. And for the first time in Germany's history, it has only friends on every side. I think with that good prosperity comes responsibility.
Mr. Hodges, I would like to thank you for your perspectives and your time.
Vlad, thank you for the privilege.
Ja, und jetzt, lieber YouTube-Abonnent, du hast gehört, Amerika hat eine ganz bestimmte Perspektive, nachzulesen in diesem Buch Future War, jetzt seit kurzem auch auf Deutsch erhältlich. Und warum ich das Buch so besonders wertvoll fand, ist, es ist nicht so weichgespült, wie was man in Politikwissenschaften oder in der Schule lernt, sondern es ist ein militärischer Ansatz und es gibt militärische Antworten auf die aktuelle Bedrohung Europas. Also eine ganz klare Leseempfehlung von mir. Und falls du die andere Seite sehen möchtest, das letzte Interview mit Dr. Daniele Ganser ist irgendwo oben auf YouTube verlinkt. Bis bald auf Bei Menschen überzeugen und kommentiere gerne deine Meinung unten in die Kommentare. Ciao, ciao.